Hello and welcome to the first Out and Equal Global Webinar of 2018, Perspectives on LGBT Workplace Equality in Singapore. My name is Ben Demers. I'm the Global Initiatives Associate here at Out and Equal, and I'll be your host for today's webinar, taking over from Steve Roth, our Senior Director of Global Initiatives, who, as many of you know, usually hosts this webinar series. The Global Webinar Series is a bi-monthly series of 1-hour-long calls focused on LGBT workplace topics outside of the United States and on a global scale. And today's topic, as mentioned, will be a deeper dive into workplace equality initiatives in Singapore. We have a really great lineup of speakers for you today from both the private and NGO sectors in Singapore, who will both be giving presentations later in the call, and I'll be introducing them a bit later. First, I want to announce that this is a broadcast audio call taking place from 7:30 to 8:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So if you're in Singapore, that's about 11:30 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. So thank you to anyone who's been able to stay up that late. And just a reminder that we'll be sending out a recording after the call along with the slide deck you'll see here today, so that anyone who wasn't able to see the call will be able to see. Because this is a broadcast audio call, we encourage you to use your speakers or your headset on your computer. So if you're having trouble hearing, the first option is always turning up your volume. Also, there's a chat function, so you should be able to chat in questions. So if you're having any technical difficulties, or if you just have questions for our presenters during the call, be sure to use that function. And if you know anyone who's having a problem signing in, the easiest method is go to readytalk.com, click join a meeting, and use the access code provided here to access the call. Some quick announcements before we get started. The first two is to announce 2 upcoming webinars that we have. The first is our next Virtual Summit Series webinar on January 25th, and that'll be on stakeholder engagement in today's polarized environment, knowing how to respond. After that, we have our next global webinar series. In the past, this series has primarily focused on place-based locales and mentioning and doing a deeper dive into LGBT workplace equality in different countries. Today, Singapore is the last example of that, and in the future, we'll be moving towards more topics, larger global topics. So the first one will be multilateral engagement with global LGBT business practices, taking a deeper look at the United Nations, which we're very excited to bring to you. Also to announce some upcoming events, the major one being our annual Executive Forum, which will be taking place from March 28th to 30th in San Francisco. And a quick plug, you can go to Out and Equal's website and check out our Young Global Leaders Scholarship. This scholarship is to attend Expo, and it's aimed at those doing LGBT work outside of the United States who are in the first 10 to 15 years of their career, and is meant to help those who are unable to attend Executive Forum anyways to really get that training and advance their careers to the next stages. And of course, on the final day of Executive Forum, we'll be hosting our Momentum Gala, which is really great. It's always a really fun night, and we have a very inspiring lineup of speakers. So we encourage anyone who can attend to be there. Before I introduce you to today's speakers, I want to just do a quick poll just to get a better feel for who's on the call. So does your company operate in Singapore? And we have a few options here, whether you're headquartered, have a branch division, and people can send in the results just by clicking directly onto the slides. Great, and we can see some answers starting to come in. Great, and so it looks like we don't have so many who are headquartered there, but have a large portion of participants today who have a branch or division. So of course, a lot of knowing how to operate in that context is important. Awesome. So now I can introduce you to our speakers. First, we have Leow Yangfa, the Executive Director of Oogachaga. Yangfa will be speaking, he'll be giving a legal context of LGBT issues in Singapore, and then talking a bit more about the work that Oogachaga as an NGO does in Singapore, including some of their collaborations with business. And following Yangfa, we'll have Sophie Guerin. She's the Head of Diversity and Inclusion for Asia Pacific, Greater China, and Japan with Dell. And Sophie will be giving a bit more perspective on how Dell started their LGBT ERG in Singapore, which will give some really great tips for those of you on the call who are wondering how to start your own ERG in the region. Yeah, so without further ado, I'll pass it over to Yangfa.
Hello everyone, greetings from hot and humid Singapore. I'm Yangfa, I'm Executive Director of Oogachaga. Today I would like to share briefly with all of you our perspectives of working with the corporate sector from the position of a non-profit LGBTQ plus organization based here in Singapore. So what is Oogachaga? Besides having a really unusual name, we are also Singapore's only community-based, non-profit professional counseling and support organization working with LGBTQ plus individuals, couples, and families. And we have been doing this in Singapore continuously since 1999, so that's coming quite close to 20 years. Just to give you a quick overview of our services and programs, in the upper row on the slide, you see our counseling services and where we provide support for the local community through face-to-face professional counseling, hotline, email, and WhatsApp services. In the lower row, you see that in addition to our counseling services, we also provide professional training in the form of talks and workshops for our fellow social workers and counselors and colleagues in the healthcare and community sectors. And as well as we also engage and collaborate very actively with our partners in the community and corporate sectors. Well, I wonder how many of you here listening in have been to Singapore or are in Singapore, or maybe you might be familiar with the legal context here with regard to sexual orientation and gender identity. Well, despite what you may sometimes read about Singapore in the media, it is actually not illegal to be gay in Singapore, unlike in some other countries. It is actually, however, technically illegal to have gay sex. Same difference, but just let me explain a little bit. Section 377A of the Penal Code criminalizes sexual behavior, and it does not criminalize sexual orientation or identity. It basically criminalizes any form, and it specifically criminalizes any form of sex between mutually consenting adult men in public as well as in private. 10 years ago in 2007, a petition was presented to Parliament to repeal this particular piece of legislation, 377A. And in his speech to wrap up the subsequent debates in the chamber, the Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong actually stated that we do not, to quote, "we do not harass gays, the government does not act as moral policemen, and we do not proactively enforce Section 377A on them." Interestingly, as you can see from the graphic, he made that speech while wearing a pink shirt. Anyway, 377A was not repealed despite the parliamentary petition and debates, and despite two constitutional challenges in 2014, 377A exists to this day in our statutes. However, it bears reminding that despite the Prime Minister's reassurance, we know that the presence of 377A in Singapore creates a homophobic and transphobic environment, and it actually legitimizes institutionalized homophobia and transphobia. Just want to go on to talk a bit about the work of Oogachaga in engaging with the corporate sector, the scope of our work. We operate openly as a registered non-profit company with charity status. We see engaging with the corporate sector as a very important part of our work, from providing community information and resources, consultation to with key HR staff, as well as raising awareness at internal staff networks, collaborating on fundraising events, and also conducting relevant D&I training programs. Just want to offer another question to all of you listening in. Just tell us, if your company has offices outside of the US, does it actively engage with the local LGBTQ NGOs? Tell us.
Great, and we're seeing some great response there. As we know, many of the partners are very engaged outside of the United States, and so that's reflected here. Still getting some responses in, but yeah, looking like the majority of those on the call are doing work with organizations outside the United States as well.
Okay, we're good to go. So in the past 18 months, we actually seen in Singapore a shift in our government's attitude towards international corporate engagement with the local LGBT community. Here you see a photo of Pink Dot 2017, and Pink Dot is a public LGBT rally held annually in Singapore. It has been happening since 2009. This photo captures some 20,000 individual Singapore citizens and permanent residents standing tall and proud, with pink torchlights supporting the freedom to love. And this photo was taken on the evening of 1st July 2017, last year. In late 2016, the government actually imposed strict restrictions on multinational companies, preventing them from sponsoring public LGBT events. So overnight, big names like Barclays, Goldman Sachs, Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, and many others were actually prohibited from financially supporting an event like Pink Dot. However, the incredible team of unpaid volunteers behind Pink Dot were able to actually turn this around and actually launched a local campaign and rallied more than 100 local SMEs, small and medium enterprises, to raise the funds they needed to continue the event in 2017 and certainly beyond as well. At the same time, just as an observation, in light of the government restrictions, we noticed that there was kind of a palpable sense that some of the multinationals were becoming a bit more wary of openly engaging with local LGBT groups, if you will, almost like a retreat back to the closet for some of them. And then, of course, another way to look at this might be to sort of see it as pragmatic resistance. It's actually a phrase that was coined by a local law professor, Dr. Lynette Chua, to kind of explain how we in Singapore adapt to changes in our local context and kind of navigate the various challenges thrown at us, and particularly relevant to the LGBT community. So time for another quick poll question for everyone. If you know what Pink Dot is, have you personally attended a Pink Dot event, whether in Singapore or in any of other cities? Some other cities in the world that have hosted Pink Dot include Taiwan, Hong Kong, Montreal, Utah, and I believe Anchorage, if you've been there. Not many people.
So yeah, we do have a few on the call who have attended Pink Dot events, so that's great. Good to see them engaging with those activities, both in Singapore and elsewhere. That was interesting to hear in Montreal. I never knew that they operated that far outside of Singapore.
And Okinawa as well, I just want to add. Okay, good to go. Just kind of want to finish off by reflecting on some of the impact we have observed, the impact made by some of the local LGBT groups like Oogachaga and Pink Dot and others, and kind of as a result of our engagement with the corporate sector locally. We've seen examples of individual staff, as a result of knowing about our work, coming out to volunteer with us in various capacities, where we've seen that certainly across the board. We've also seen leadership and visibility from our allies, including international as well as local staff, and that's been really encouraging. And also, in spite of the sometimes hostile environment we face here in Singapore, we have also, as a result, hopefully, of our corporate engagement, we have also generated more conversations about creating more safe, queer spaces in the workplace. So that's me for now. Thank you all so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Yangfa. It's great to hear about the work that Oogachaga is doing in Singapore and to get a little bit more of that context, which I think will set a really great background also for this next presentation, talking a bit about how businesses can get more involved and how, if you're having difficulty starting an ERG in Singapore, how you can really get that work off the ground. So I'll hand it over to you, Sophie.
Great, thank you. Yangfa, wonderful context setting, and just congratulations on all the fantastic work that you and your colleagues do at Oogachaga. Yes, Pink Dot, if you haven't had a chance to go, I see there's some great comments in the chat box. Please do try to make the effort to attend. It is truly an incredible and inspiring event. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share a little bit around our ongoing journey to drive LGBTI inclusion in the region. I'm going to start to share with you a little bit of context on how we got started in Asia. I won't dwell too much on that, but that's just for those of you who are thinking about growing your network in Singapore. It's really important that you do some kind of big picture homework first, so that you can have a strong foundation for success when you do launch and grow in Singapore. So this is kind of what we're going to, just to give you a heads up about how we're going to frame the conversation. But before I get started, I have 3 questions to help shape the content a little bit today, and I'll make sure that I tailor my comments to the majority of the respondents. So I'd like to start by asking, what is your LGBT ally engagement status in Singapore? So you have an LGBTI ally employee network, your company is a member of an external industry network, or you have no network affiliation in Singapore. So an example of an external industry network may be Interbank, for example.
Great, and we're seeing some of those results starting to come in. So it looks like the majority of those on the call today don't have a network affiliation yet in Singapore, though there's also a large portion of those who have an employee network at their company, but still a big need for it.
Okay, great. Next slide. Okay, and then what are your, Ben, would you mind helping me go to the next slide?
Sorry about that.
This is technically, thanks. So the next question is, what's the biggest barrier to opening a network in Singapore? Is it local leadership, lack of clarity on the legal landscape, customers, employees, resources? That could be financial, that could be capital, human capital, or other.
Great, and seeing those responses also coming in. Looks like the biggest barrier is resources, so getting enough finances and people at your company, as well as lack of clarity on the legal landscape. For that other option, if people want to send in some of the barriers they're facing through the chat function, just so we have a better idea of the situation in Singapore.
Okay. Okay, and then is there one more question? Okay. So the final question is, what is your internal employee network status in Singapore? You have an LGBTI employee network. You have concrete plans to open one in 2008. You want to open one, but no plans yet, and there's a desire to open one. And if the poll is closed, if you can put that in the comment box, that would just be great. Okay. All right. Well, why don't we move on then? That, we can kind of come to that later in the Q&A section. If we, I'll just jump ahead then and get on to our Pride journey. So I want to give you a little bit of sense about how we got started, because the timeline for launching a Pride network in Asia it may be a little bit long. So it's really important. You have a core group in the beginning with a strong roadmap for long-term growth. So as you think about launching your network in Singapore and growing it, you really want to make sure that for each investment that you make as an organization, you're thinking about 3 or 4 steps ahead about how is that going to help you continue to grow your network, a year from now. So the way that we got started was that we started with a soft launch of Pride through a Pride working group, and this was back in Q3 of 2015. We didn't have a network in Asia at the time. Pride is one of 14 employee resource groups at Dell. It represents roughly 2,000 individuals in 18 countries, and we have 29 chapters across the globe. So mindful of the fact that we knew the landscape was changing, we knew our customers were really driving LGBTI inclusion, and we knew the time was right. We had enough employees that were saying, this is something that we want to drive. We knew we needed to get started. But for us to be able to do that, we needed to have an executive sponsor. So we had a group of allies and champions within the organization that wanted to drive this issue. We had an executive sponsor who helped to bring in the larger executive population into that conversation. And that really laid a strong foundation for us to actually get some of the initiatives off the ground. Before we could actually launch a chapter, however, training was essential. Training so that people understood why we were talking about LGBTI inclusion in the workplace. For most employees in the region, this was the first time that they had talked about LGBTI inclusion. And so LGBTI 101 education, helping people understand why this was important in a workplace context. So we offered that training tailored to the Asia context in both Mandarin and in English, and it was offered across the region. You could dial in and listen to it live, or you could listen to it at a webinar. So you could be at home and listen to it. You could be in the office, and you could listen to it. Wherever you were, it was available to you. And we did that mindful of that we, along our journey, we wanted people to be able to tap into that content at any time. As we move forward on that journey, one of the things that we also wanted to offer to individuals was the opportunity to participate in our Pride networks, regardless of where they were located. So the way that we work as an organization is that our chapters or the locations of our networks are physically place-based networks. So we have a network now in Singapore, we have a network in Sydney, but we wanted to have employees in other regions be able to tap into that. And we knew we were going to open in Singapore, and so we wanted to be able to have kind of that groundwork and be able to build a network of champions in Singapore that we could rely on in the future. So we launched the first for Dell, which was a remote chapter. And this was, you could be a virtual chapter, so to speak. You could be anywhere in the world, and you could join this, and you could get access to information, and you could be part of our conversations. We then really started to build on our external engagement. We partnered with Pride and Diversity in Sydney to build our capacity LGBTI inclusion, to understand more what our customers were doing in this space. We could make sure that our strategy aligned to what the business is focusing on. And that was really a way for us to drive cultural integration when we went through the largest tech merger in history at the beginning of last year. And as a result of that, we had a much larger leadership team as well as a whole new crop of allies across our organization. And so we took that pool of expanded individuals, and through the local leadership in Singapore, we began to prepare for a Singapore launch. I see that there are some questions, and the colleagues on the phone are going to help me address some of that as we get into it toward the Q&A section towards the end. So we identified a larger pool of allies across the organization, and they helped us to really get that foundation ready for a launch. So we focused on identifying local executive leaders who would serve as allies for our launch. We leveraged that network to reach out to our customers, to invite them and engage them to be part of that conversation. And then we also leveraged that network to reach out to key stakeholders in the region. And I'll get into more details about the nuts and bolts of that launch in the next coming slides. But we did officially launch in September of 2007. When we talk about how did we lay that foundation and that preparation, one of the things that we did is we focused a lot on communication. So I know I did manage to read one or two of the trainings questions, and I will talk a little bit about that in this. So when we sent out the communications as we were preparing for the launch of Pride in Asia, and again as we were preparing for the launch of Pride in Singapore, we did a couple of things. So we sent our communications regarding the launch to all team members in Asia, and it was in multiple languages. So the first time we launched in Asia, it was in Chinese, it was in English, and it was in Japanese. When we launched in Singapore, it was in English and Chinese. And in that content, we focused on our commitment to diversity and inclusion, our global track record on LGBTI inclusion. So those were some things that we hadn't fully communicated previously, and was really critical for us to build that business case. We talked about our senior leadership's commitment to LGBTI inclusion. We provided a locally relevant business case that touched on emerging talent trends. We touched on emerging consumer demographics. We touched on the benefits around productivity and talent retention, really using Asia-specific examples and data. And we provided links to additional information that was in multiple languages. And then we provided our LGBTI training in multiple languages. And we partnered with an organization that Out and Equal knows quite well called Community Business, who developed that content for us, and we leveraged those recordings. We also wanted to, mindful of our resources and that we would need to be able to leverage resources well into the future, whatever we created at that time, we wanted to be able to use well into the future. So we started by developing a pride badge that people could wear around their neck. And again, this was similar to the concept around when we started a remote chapter. We wanted people to be able to wear this wherever they were in Asia, regardless of whether or not there was a pride chapter, so that we could really start to reinforce that commitment to LGBTI inclusion across the region. And so we decided to lead with an ally campaign in Asia. And so we took the word ally and translated that into the local languages of the offices in the countries in which we operate. So you can see that has been translated into those languages. Now, in some cases, they didn't have the word ally, so we used the word friend. And then it just says pride and Dell. So this is something that people could wear around their neck at any time, and it really just signals our commitment. And now if you go to many of our offices, you just see you see a kind of a sea of rainbow badges when people wear this around. It's really inspiring to see. This is the photo. Now I'm going to move into the Singapore Pride launch details a little bit. So this photo is taken from that launch, and you'll see that in this photo we have team members who've flown in from India. So they use this as an opportunity to understand more about how they would launch in India. We have representatives from the U.S. Embassy. We have our local leaders support. We have several customers in attendance, as well as our executives. Showed up to our launch. And the way that we aimed our launch, and I'll show you some of the slides that we presented at that event, is we framed the launch of Singapore Pride in the context of Asia LGBTI inclusion, context of global LGBTI inclusion. Launching an LGBTI ally network in Singapore was an exception to the norm. And we really wanted to reinforce across Asia, there was a strong commitment to LGBTI inclusion from Dell team members as well as customers. And the same would go for global. We also focused, as I mentioned, on allies and sponsors, so that was really a critical component to our launch. And we really wanted to make sure we had top leaders who were able to articulate their commitment to LGBTI inclusion at the event. And then finally, we invited customers and executives. And that was really critical for our team members to understand that that LGBTI inclusion is critical for our organization and for our business and for our sustainability long into the future. So I mentioned a little bit about providing that global context. And so this is what we showed. So we showed our chairman and CEO, Michael Dell, his commitment to LGBTI inclusion. We highlighted some social media from North America, from Latin America, from Europe, from Australia. And just so that folks understood the scope of LGBTI inclusion across our broader organization. And while I think, at least I'll be candid to say, is I had the assumption that people were aware of that, and it really wasn't until we started to do that deep diving around in preparation for that we realized that some people just weren't aware of it. And so that was really essential for us to stress at that event. We then looked at the Asia support for Pride. So a few months before we actually launched in Singapore, we did a Show Your Pride for Pride event, where we encouraged our team members to we did a hashtag campaign called #BeYourself, and folks were encouraged to either dress in a rainbow color, to have a rainbow flag, to use the hashtag in a creative way and send us their photos. We had over 160 entries from across Asia, and these were in markets where there was a perception among many team members where there was no interest in LGBTI inclusion, nor was it possible to have the conversation around LGBTI inclusion. So we had submissions from China, from Malaysia, from Taiwan, from Singapore, from India, Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, and we included some highlights from our customers as well. And this was to reinforce, there was, and Yangfa talked about this a little bit, there was the perception that we couldn't talk about it, and that folks weren't ready to have this conversation. And once we just put the call out there for engagement, none of this was centrally organized. This was all employee-driven, wanting to engage in this conversation. And so that was really, I think, a big aha moment for folks in Singapore. And then I mentioned a little bit around our executive sponsors and allies. You can see we had our Singapore leader articulate his commitment to LGBTI inclusion and why being an ally was important to him. We had our executive sponsor for Pride in the region, as well as our chapter leader, Chris Steffens, who really played an instrumental role in getting this off the ground. And all of them articulated in very personal terms why LGBTI inclusion was so important. And so that's how we balance that kind of business case story with personal, with the personal drive and commitment to being an ally. And then finally, we invited our customers. So again, that was really important for us to be able to show our team members and our leaders why this was so critical for us as an organization. And so we invited the head of diversity and inclusion for APAC and Bloomberg to come in and speak a little bit around their work, as well as why diversity and inclusion was so critical for them. We were also joined by our regional president and his executive leadership team as well. And so that really sent an overwhelming message to to middle management as well as individual contributors that LGBTI inclusion is highly valued by our leaders within our organization, and it's part of who we are as a company. So I know that there's lots of questions coming. I am going to just give you some tips and lessons learned. I know people always love, it's always good to have a little checklist, a little cheat sheet that you can look at. So I'm just going to highlight a few of these lessons for you, and these were things that we learned throughout the process. One is make sure that you engage your executives throughout the rollout process. Ground up is not what is not that alone cut it in Asia. You really need to have your executives engaged throughout the process. Ensure that you communicate regularly with local stakeholders like Oogachaga to track shifts in LGBTI inclusion in the market. This is not just limited to Singapore, but most likely in Malaysia and India as well. Pushback will occur. It does occur in the market, and that's where you really need to make sure that you articulate in a locally relevant approach why LGBTI inclusion is so important in that market. And so one of the things that we found is we expected there to be much stronger pushback to launch, and in fact, it was minimal. It was very, very little pushback. And most of it was folks not understanding some of the material, so we tweaked it a little bit, resending folks some content. And it was once they had that opportunity to review some of the materials that we had in more detail, that kind of answered some of their questions and concerns. But by and large, it was very minimal. And I think in large part that was due to executive engagement and support. With peers to form an industry network like Interbank, if there's minimal local take-up, that way you can continue to drive progress in this space. Make sure that you do this in multiple languages. You can, if your organization doesn't have that capacity, you can find people in your team that can do that, and build a strong business case to closely tie to your business needs and objectives. All right, so that is, thank you so much. I hope that answers some questions. I hope you have a good sense of where you might be able to go, and I'm happy to take any questions and hand it back over to Steve and Ben.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, Yangfa. Both fantastic presentations really gave a better idea of what the situation is in Singapore around LGBT workplace equality to help further others' initiatives. We're getting great questions in. First, I actually just wanted to summarize that poll question about whether your company has an internal LGBT ally network. It sounds like a lot of people were saying that they do have a network at their company already, which is great, and then for those who don't, be able to take some of the information from this call and hopefully push that forward. Also a comment concerning resources leaving Singapore sent in with resources being one of the major challenges that, or lack of resources being one of the major challenges that those working on LGBT workplace equality in Singapore face. Mentioned that a lot of the resources that or initiatives that start in Singapore can then leave the country and sort of lose the momentum that was started. I'm curious, Yangfa or Sophie, if either of you have seen that sort of situation where somebody will start an LGBT initiative at a company and then end up leaving Singapore for some reason, or leaving the company that they were at.
This is Sophie. Happy to take that on. So one of the things that we have is in our Pride network is we have a strong structure. Actually, we have this for all our employee resource groups. So there are chapter leaders, and then within that chapter there are pillars, and each pillar, which drives certain initiatives, has a leader. So when there is a change, well, yes, that is disruptive. We do have people ready to go who can step into that leadership role and continue to maintain momentum. I think what's probably the most difficult is when an executive sponsor leaves. So that's where we work on making sure that we have more than one executive sponsor, and that allows us, so if there is a change in that leadership, we have someone else who can continue to move forward, and then we act quickly to identify another executive sponsor to take on the momentum.
Yeah, but just this is Yangfa. Just wanted to add to that. Yes, we have seen before how sometimes the group kind of is just not able to continue because of a lack of continuity. I mean, that's most important. So putting in place, even as you're setting an ERG, to put in place continuity plans. As in all good businesses, you have continuity plans. So for the key lead, the co-chairs, and the reality is people do move around and resources do move around as well. So take that into consideration as you're setting up at whatever point of the setup of the group, whether it's really still in its developmental phase or even when it's more established, to build that team to be ready for changes that can happen and will happen.
Great, yeah. It really shows the importance of having that good structure in place for any changes that might occur. We have a question here from Aaron asking, I would love to know more about how the panelists are navigating the evolving dialogue and issues related to the expansion of the community. So the addition of kind of the plus sign and of the addition of different segments under the LGBTQ, et cetera, umbrella. What is this like in Singapore, and how are companies tending to deal with this internally?
I just have a thought to respond to that. It certainly increasingly in Singapore, at least, certainly with language. Just staying with English, for example, some of us within the community, at least, are slowly moving away from all these letters, the queer, the LGBTQI alphabet soup. Some people are comfortable with that. Increasingly, more and more people are comfortable with using more encompassing language like queer and gender diverse. So it may be happening more quickly in some communities, in some areas than in others. So that in itself is a reflection of how we're using language differently. So rather than caught up with individual words, that there's increasing acceptance of a more inclusive language. I know some people listening in may be uncomfortable with being associated with the word queer, but certainly in Singapore, at least, certainly with anyone within the community who is under 30. That's what we're seeing. Whether or not this is something that's going to be happening in the corporate sector, we don't know yet, because a lot of it is also a reflection of how ready people are to have conversations about sexualities. And that sometimes we find can be, we get varying responses. So if anything, the conversations we have in that setting will be more thematic. So for example, we've organized conversations about youth, about young people. So rather than talk about identities and sexualities, we talk about groups of people, young people, for example. Other events we've organized around themes of volunteering, for example, volunteering within the LGBTQ sector. So we haven't quite yet gone into conversations about sub-communities, if that's where the question was going.
Yeah, and we have a network of a strong network of transgender employees in the region. We haven't yet had that conversation in Singapore specifically. We have had that in Australia, India, and Malaysia. So that would probably be on the agenda for next year. But as we think about how do we build capacity and what our priorities are, it's really about how do we take the ally network and actually and really build up their skills capacity as active allies. And so that'll be probably for us the next big step. And then we'll have a real robust network of individuals who can help us to deep dive into more nuanced conversations with our employees and executives.
Ben, you want to continue?
If I could just jump to that question, which I thought was quite interesting. It was quite a specific question about the question from Jeanette. The question was about the Singapore immigration landscape for same-sex couples, either those who are legally married or otherwise. I can jump right into that, and then Sophie can add on from your experience as well. Well, the law in Singapore is quite clear. We do not recognize same-sex couples. Same-sex couples, whether registered, whether Singaporeans registered in other countries or other nationals registered in other countries and wish to come to Singapore. That's very clear in immigration rules and in our Registry of Marriages Act. We do not recognize same-sex relationships or marriages or partnerships of any form, even if they're legal in other countries. So what this means is that our government will not issue a dependence visa for the same-sex spouse. So what it means is that from an immigration perspective, if spouse A were to have a job in Singapore, same-sex spouse B would be able to enter Singapore only as a visitor or as a tourist, unless there are situations where same-sex spouse B may be able to get a job in their own right and get their own employment pass, so they are able to legally stay in Singapore as an employee. So we have an employment pass sponsored. Or another option would be to obtain another type of visa to be able to stay legally in Singapore for an extended period. So it could be a student visa or a business visa as a business owner. So another form of a visa to be able to stay. And then obviously the third option would be to do the usual visa run. In and out of Singapore, obviously that is not ideal, and you can imagine the impact on the relationship. The same-sex relationship. And we also know of numerous situations where children are involved, and even then it depends on other technicalities as well. So I won't go into too much detail, but I can imagine the kind of stress it can cause on the relationship and on the family. So that's what it means for same-sex partners relationships in Singapore.
Yeah. Great. And actually wanted to ask a question that was directed at Sophie about your badges. It's from Christopher. It says, the badge is a great idea. How did you differentiate between allies and members? Was there a member badge as well as an ally badge, or was a member also considered an ally? So in other words, just what badge?
Yeah, so we just use ally. And so the goal in Asia is not about to join Pride, you don't need to come out. It's really more about creating a safe and inclusive workplace in Asia. And so we lead with an ally campaign. And so if you join Pride, you're an ally. And if you're more than welcome to share more around your personal story and your personal journey, but everyone is an ally. And so that's and you'll find that to be the norm in Asia, mindful of the cultural context in this region. That is a way for people to begin to have a conversation around LGBT inclusion. Attitudes here are changing rapidly, but it is really about, first and foremost, creating an environment where people feel safe and they feel welcome. And one of the great things about having an ally campaign, and you may find this within your own organization, and I've had employees say this to me, that coming to work is the one time that they can be themselves and they can feel safe. So that is for me, what kind of is first and foremost as I think about how do we position and pride within our organization in Asia.
Great. We have a question from Juan asking about acknowledging that sometimes the government or official authorities in Singapore are not as supportive of LGBT diversity initiatives. So wondering what kind of challenges the two of you maybe have each faced from the government for your own inclusion initiatives with your organizations. Maybe send that to Sophie first.
Yeah, sure. We haven't had any challenges. We haven't done any external engagement in Singapore. We've really focused on building capacity internally. At this moment, that has not been a challenge that we have run into. And at this moment, we are continuing to focus internally on building and educating our team members internally so that we can be positioned for long-term success.
Maybe I might just stick my neck out and sort of add a little bit to that. And in one of my slides, I mentioned something about the possibility of some multinationals kind of retreating back to the closet. By that, I'm referring to, there's the reality that in view of the tightening of legislation on multinationals supporting public LGBT events, we do know that some multinationals based in Singapore are a bit more cautious about being how they're being seen. So what that often would translate to is being a bit more careful about internal or just restricting LGBT events to just internal staff networks and being a bit more discreet, I suppose, about whom they invite to these events and also about publicity as well. So that's just an observation we've had in recent months.
Right. Sophie, another question for you. This is from Eddie asking, could you expand a bit on what you said about leadership thinking? This is not a topic that we discuss here in Singapore to some of the great employee-driven events. How did you convince leadership how to plunge into LGBT workplace inclusion?
I think interestingly enough, a lot of some of this is also a generational gap. So, we do see this. I do see this from. This is more of a reflection around some of our more senior leaders in that sense, whereas the younger employees have a slightly different take on the conversation. So what I really focus on is talking about it from a customer standpoint. I always go back to the customer because that really is at the core of the organization and the core of the business focus. So helping our leaders understand what our top customers are doing in this space is essential for moving the needle. So that's why I made sure that we had Bloomberg come in and talk about what they were doing. I regularly share anecdotes and stories around what customers are doing, the innovative programs that they're driving. I often share benchmarking data with our executives, and then I share personal stories. So I anonymize personal stories of team members in my day-to-day work. I hear stories quite frequently, and then I share that. So I complement data with the personal in terms of what does this mean for the team members within our company and within our organization. And so you put those two pieces together, and that really does shift the needle. And then it's also about, it comes from the top. So this is Michael Dell's commitment to it, and that really sets the bar and the standard for what it means to be a leader within our organization. And again, I have to say, I think once we provided that content in Mandarin as well, that was really helpful, because that way, if people are trying to read it in a second language and it's a topic that perhaps they have never ever discussed, and they may be a little uncomfortable with having this conversation that they're not particularly familiar with, not having to worry about the language and being able to read it in your own language makes it a little, I think, makes it easier to engage with. So that it's worth it to take the time to invest in local language translation.
Definitely. Sophie, actually another question for you regarding global versus local driven events.
Yeah.
How much do you find that the events in the Singapore ERG are driven by local initiatives, and how much by the Global Pride agenda?
It's entirely driven locally. Entirely driven locally. So that's just one of the ways that we operate as an organization, is that an ERG chapter has to be, when it starts, it has to be because employees want it, and they succeed based on the input of the team members at the local level. So my job is to help them from a resourcing standpoint. So we provide a budget to them. I connect them to best practices, making sure I help to open doors when need be. But the actual planning, the legwork, what comes out of the events is really the employees themselves. And in that slide that I showed with all of the photos of folks showing their pride for Pride, that was all the employee. We simply put out a call and asked people to participate, and then that was the employee's response. So yeah, it is employee driven, which helps to build a case as well.
Right, definitely. A question for Yangfa: is there a ranking for the organizations in Singapore that are LGBTI friendly? Is there a ranking or a database?
I love that question. But the quick answer is there isn't one. However, the long answer will be we're open to anyone who would like to come in to help us do that. So if anyone knows of a way, of resources or expertise to come in to help us do that, we are quite happy to. We do have similar rankings done by community business in Hong Kong as well as in India, but not so in Singapore. Maybe just double check, Sophie, did I get that right?
Yeah,
there isn't such an index
in Singapore.
Yeah.
A question from Hesperus for you, Sophie. Can you elaborate a bit more on how you partner with industry peers? Is there like a particular network that Dell taps into?
Yeah, there is a network that's recently launched among tech companies in Singapore, and so we are going to get involved with them next year. So the Singapore chapter leader, Chris Steffens, who I briefly showed his photo, he will be our representative at that event. And then for those companies in the financial industry, you have Interbank as well, and those are some networks that you can tap into. But I certainly would encourage you not to be limited by what is currently on offer. If you have a couple of like-minded organizations that you currently work with, you guys can get together and start to have a conversation and kind of go in it together and about, encouraging each other, providing best practices, having a resource you can go to say, hey, I've gotten stuck here, I need some help. Do you have some suggestions or ideas, or could you come in and talk to my leadership? It's really, you find there's tremendous amount of collaboration in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Asia actually in general among companies, maybe even companies that are traditionally competitors in this space. So I would encourage you to work with companies that you already have strong relationships with as you expand into Singapore, and have your own sort of network. If none of those either the financial or tech networks may not be relevant for your organization.
Great. And one final question. Has the current political climate in the United States contributed to a retreating back into the closet with some multinationals or in attitudes towards LGBT programs by corporations headquartered in Asia, which I think both of you can probably speak to?
Not for us, no, and I can't speak for other companies, but no, not for us at all. We are, actively moving forward with expansion into, most likely we'll be looking at expanding a chapter in India next year. We're looking at China. This LGBTI inclusion is a real catalyst for inclusion in the region, and we see that the successes in Singapore and in our virtual chapter and in Sydney have really inspired employees and have really had a lot of executives kind of take note of some of those achievements, and they're really keen to bring some of that best practice and that kind of customer engagement as well into their countries, and looking at how they can bring pride into those regions.
Well, my response to that would be no, we haven't seen that either. Well, maybe not yet. If anything, a lot of it is maybe just business as usual, and it might or might not have something to do with the fact that in Singapore we still don't have a U.S. ambassador, so that might be one reason.
Great. I think we actually will have time for one more question. A question from Michael: how can differing inclusive cultural perspectives be shared and embraced across different cultures in Singapore? Can either of you speak to that, and just how diversity within Singapore, cultural diversity, is embraced more generally?
Yangfa, do you want to take that one first?
Actually, just think of Sophie, your the initiative with having different languages and having material available in different languages. That's really, really powerful as well. I'm reminded of how very often when we engage with corporate partners in the office setting, yes, we love talking to LGBT networks and all that, and very often we may or may not have openly out LGBT employees in the audience. However, more often than not, there will be, somebody who sits in the corner or maybe in the front row or just comes up during the tea break and would identify themselves as a parent or sibling or somebody who knows somebody who is LGBTQ, and that's the kind of impact that we see as very significant. So again, having that information and available, and for them to bring it home to somebody, it could be the mother of a young person who is just coming out. So mother can bring material home for father to read, and that kind of information is very impactful as well. So having those allies in the room. So allies in the room within the office setting, and then obviously hopefully that translates into being allies at home and within their own communities as well. Something else that we are very aware of as we are working within the local community is that perhaps it's quite unique to Singapore, perhaps it's unique to this part of the world. Because people spend a lot of time at work, chances are they are more likely to come out to work colleagues before they come out to family members. And that's something that I suppose shouldn't surprise us, but when we realize that it sort of makes sense, because we spend so much time with people at work, so the sense of trust and safety is, I suppose, something that has been groomed, and then you decide to come out to people around you at work, and then it's something that you do before you actually come out to maybe even other people in your own home or even your own religious community, for example. So having that safe, queer spaces is so important, regardless
Absolutely.
of our cultural backgrounds.
And I think also building on that, Yangfa, is, a lot of in Asia, people will live with their parents for much longer. So I think speaking to your point about going into work can really be a place where you can be yourself and it can be safe. I think that should also be, companies should keep that in mind. It's also just family and living situations are a little different in Asia by and large. Speaking of the cross-cultural piece, that was why for us it was so essential that we had local leadership speak at our Singapore launch and articulate why being an ally was important, and that they were there in attendance. And one of the risks in a Western multinational company is that it is Western expatriates who are leading that conversation, and so it's really essential that we had our Singapore allies visible and speaking about why this was important. The other organization I was thinking about is PFLAG. PFLAG does some really fantastic work in Asia. And they have some remarkable conversations with families, and they do work with companies as well, and really help to make this conversation personal, and have done just tremendous work in the region. So that would be another organization for those folks on the call to look into, and reach out to PFLAG chapters here in the region.
Great.
And just add on to that, in Singapore, the equivalent organization is called SAFE Singapore, and SAFE stands for Supporting, Affirming, and Empowering Our LGBTQ Friends and Family.
Perfect. One of the questions we actually, for any questions we didn't get to, we're going to try to do a write-up afterwards, so we'll try to get those answers out. Don't worry if we missed your question. And I think one of them was actually on some of those organizations, so we'll hopefully be able to provide a short list of others doing work in Singapore that people can tap into. We're a bit over time, but just wanted to give a few moments to both our presenters to thank them and to ask if they have any closing remarks they want to add to summarize their fantastic presentations today. Yangfa?
Just a quick shout out to all of you out there. Singapore is probably not the easiest place to work and live in if you happen to identify as L or G or B or T or Q or any other letters of the alphabet soup. However, it's not impossible. Again, there is support available for you. If the support is not there for you, mobilize it, find it, get the resources, talk to people. As Sophie said, don't do it alone. Get people involved.
Absolutely. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And on that, building on that, it is entirely possible. Many of you already have a network there. If you are finding that your network is stagnating, feel free to reach out. I'd be more than happy to work and collaborate. There are companies that are keen to drive these initiatives, that companies work together on this. So there is a community for you to rely on and to reach out to regarding growing or launching your chapter. And take what you have learned in Singapore and bring that to other regions. So often, if you're thinking about India as well, you can take some of the learnings and the practices in Singapore and bring that to India or in other markets and vice versa. So do look at Singapore as the achievements and the successes that you can make there as really learnings for you as you continue to grow across the region.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for those presentations. Just some quick closing remarks before we end the webinar today. I know we are a bit over time. A reminder that we have our next virtual summit series webinar on January 25th on stakeholder engagement in today's polarized environment, as well as our next global webinar on March 14th, talking a bit about the United Nations and its engagement with global LGBT business practices. And if you haven't yet signed up but are interested, registration is open for Out and Equal Executive Forum from March 28th to 30th. We would love to see you there in San Francisco and be able to do a deeper dive into LGBT workplace strategies. And we hope to see you on our next webinar. Thank you all for being on the call today.